Zimmerman's acquittal has resulted in waves of mass outrage among black people and all anti-racists. The verdict should, and once and for all, puncture the myth of a post-racial or colorblind America. The verdict is judicial affirmation of an unrelenting assault on African Americans manifested in the courts, the prison system, and the racist demonization that lies behind it all. As George Zimmerman said, he was out to teach a lesson to those punks who always get away with it. Whatever the jury says, the racist intent of Zimmerman is clear. Many of those who defend the verdict have tried not to defend Zimmerman so much as the so-called process of justice. What must be repeated is that this is not the first and is unlikely to be the last time the legal system sets free the killer of a black man because of reasonable doubt. Of course, that Zimmerman was even arrested and brought to trial is a tribute to the struggle to the masses of people all over the U.S. who marched in hoodies demanding justice. There is even speculation that the prosecution through the trial deliberately making errors that cost them the conviction. The strategy of the defense and its supporters, both inside and outside the courtroom, was to play to racism. Faced with an uphill battle in the perception of Zimmerman, the defense immediately resorted to racist stereotyping, trying to turn Martin into a thug, or in Zimmerman's word, one of those punks. They even trotted out the old hobby horse of reverse racism, attempting to turn Martin's comments that Zimmerman was a creepy-ass cracker into proof that he was motivated to attack Zimmerman out of racial temper. It is absurd to view marijuana use, fistfights, or for that matter, identification with popular and sometimes white and hip-hop music as being uniquely prevalent only among black youth or having any broader implications on moral character. However, the rapidity with which this caused doubts to be raised points clearly to deeply ingrained racial bias in society. The verdict represents the continued disconnect between, on the one hand, the rise of black figures in politics and the corporate world, and on the other hand, the poverty and deprivation maintained with police harassment and abuse, experienced by significant numbers of black people. To fully understand the significance of the Trayvon Martin case requires we understand something of the roots and history of racism and its continued persistence today. While America was never quite colorblind in its earliest days, particularly in the Virginia colony, there was a unity of resistance among sections of the oppressed, whether they were African or poor white, and to a lesser extent Native. Noted scholar Edmund Morgan relates, "It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together." The oppressed always outnumbered the oppressors, and it is clear that the not entirely established colonial elite feared a unified resistance from slaves and indentured servants. From the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, borrowing tactics from the British oppression of Ireland, the colonial ruling class instituted a series of laws that created a legal framework for the special oppression of people of African heritage. Slaves were banned from owning property, and free blacks could not own guns, thus limiting the right to self-defense. Marriage between the races was prohibited. Finally, enshrining the word white into the legal code created for even the poorest whites a sense of relative privilege against blacks, breaking up a natural unity among the oppressed. A new white identity emerged to be defended for its relative privilege. The division of the oppressed underclasses protected the new planter elite. As the slave trade exploded and Africans were brought from all over the western coast of the continent, many nations and peoples were forged into a collective and distinctive black identity. The racial system meant to hold the black laborer in a state of bondage fed ideas of black inferiority. Intense labor competition also allowed racist ideas to permeate American culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. Two opportunities to smash the oppression of blacks, Reconstruction and populism, were crushed through a mix of racist betrayal and brute force on the part of a rising imperialism. This left by the turn of the century not only a Jim Crow system oppressing blacks in the South, but the almost total exclusion of blacks from public life throughout the United States. Ultimately, the history of racism is not a problem of race per se, but rather national oppression. Black people in the U.S. make up a nation. The long process of oppression and resistance has created, on the one hand, a distinctive culture, a body of musical, literary, and religious, among other things, expression. And on the other hand, it has created a system of racism that affects blacks from top to bottom, rich and poor, systematically excluding and limiting their ability to participate in almost every arena, consigning the majority to a deprived, impoverished existence all under a banner of inferiority. While some shy away from this conclusion, in our view, racism is a function of the oppression of blacks as a people, based on a distinctive history of repression and resistance, which in its particularities has resulted in the formation of a distinct people that is a nation. The significance of the Trayvon Martin case lies in the fact that national oppression of blacks in America is not simply racial but economic, a key element of the establishment of the American capitalist imperialist system. It is not as if the capitalist ruling class has not tried to deal with some of the effects of national oppression. More recently, they have shown a fairly remarkable openness to black faces in high places. The need for more diversity on television, in the movies, and at news desks is more or less accepted. The continued existence of disparities between black and white is denounced by even the right wing. It is often disingenuously. The reality, however, is that to uproot these disparities would require significant effort to provide employment and social services, something that goes entirely against the grain of neoliberal strategies of capital. In fact, the response to disparities by the ruling class has been to ruthlessly attack the economic position of white working people, attempting to eliminate disparities by driving down the living standards of white workers rather than uplifting poor and working black people. The persistence of concentrated poverty and unemployment, in other words, the persistence of ghettos, has provided fertile ground for a culture of poverty, blaming the victim of demonization. The thug image that the defense attempted to place on Trayvon Martin is simply a reflection of these characterizations. This is what justice for Trayvon is all about. The protests that swept the nation from right after the murder to the verdict have been predominantly black, with significant attendance from anti-racist whites and other oppressed people. These protests have focused not simply on finding a way to arrest George Zimmerman, but arresting the continued existence of oppression and exploitation. Confronting racism means confronting the long history of national oppression that continues to stalk Black America. This means recognizing that this oppression has deep roots in capitalist, imperialist U.S. society. Trayvon Martin's killings will spur all who hate oppression and exploitation to fight harder and recognize need for fundamental social change.